In cold bleak wet November, beside the Pentland Hill.
Welcome to A Cloud of Witnesses. This is an in-depth series on the history of the Christian faith.
Dragged by the Earl's dragoons through the streets of Edinburgh.
In this video, we'll focus on the events that took place in the 17th century in Scotland. We'll note the challenges facing the Presbyterians there, both from the King and the High Anglicans in England. We'll see the rise and the role of a group known as the Covenanters, who heroically resisted the enforced changes to their polity and to their worship. We'll see how they were severely persecuted in the late 17th century, a period known as the Killing Time.
To make a grisly show, her spirit was not broken, her head's held up high.
John Knox died in the year 1572. Even by that time, there were already some significant changes that had taken place within the Scottish Kirk. For example, while in 1560 there were only a dozen ministers who were professing the Reformed faith, by 1572 there were 500. There were 1,000 parishes where people were served by ministers, readers or exhorters. Public education had made significant improvements, and people were reading the scriptures in their own language. A law was passed in 1579 requiring every household of sufficient means to buy a copy of the scriptures. Although Scotland had become Presbyterian, there were still divisions, both politically and religiously. There were those who supported the infant king, James VI, who was being reared as a Protestant, and on the other side, those who supported his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was a Catholic. There were also challenges to Presbyterianism. For example, after James VI became ruler in his own right in 1583, he tried to restore Episcopalian polity. He had, by 1600, appointed 3 parliamentary bishops. It was Andrew Melville who boldly opposed James's attempts to control the church, and he led a fight to restore Presbyterianism despite opposition from the king. He had been the principal of Glasgow University, and in the year 1580 he arrived at St Andrews. Andrew Melville was a particularly important person at this time. He held the position as principal and then later dean at St Mary's College in St Andrews between the years 1580 to 1606, and he was also at different times the moderator of the Scottish Church's assemblies. Melville wanted simpler services and a relatively democratic leadership of presbyteries and assemblies. Now we're going to look briefly at some of the other changes that had taken place in the Church of Scotland during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. One significant change was in the layout of the church building. The Reformers placed the pulpit in the centre of the church, showing that the bringing of the Word of God through the sermon was to be the focus of the service. Note the central location of the pulpit in this picture of Holy Trinity in St Andrews, which was taken in the early 1900s. Interestingly, the pulpit is no longer in the centre today. Following the Scottish Reformation, communion or the Lord's Supper was celebrated much less frequently, but when it was, attendance was strictly enforced. For example, in the 1560s and 70s, citizens were fined for failure to attend. Note too the simplicity of these communion flagons, very different to the highly decorative Catholic sacramental objects. The Scottish reformers wanted to build a godly community, and central to this was the enforcing of moral discipline. Wrongdoers were brought before the Kirk, which functioned as a local church court. Now, these so-called wrongdoers were often sentenced to repent in front of the whole congregation. This was the seat at St Andrew's Kirk, where those who were publicly repenting of their misdeeds were to sit. The Kirk session at St Andrews was particularly strict. Now, this is called a stool of repentance. This was a place where wrongdoers sat while doing penance, and this was a common punishment imposed by the Kirk session. As an example, in 1575 at St Andrews, the Kirk ordered that the drunkard must sit upon the stool with a piece of paper around their head with the word fault written on it. Branks were used to punish wrongdoers, and they were worn on the head, and the metal plate for the mouth impeded the speech and swallowing. Now, they could be sentenced by the Kirk to wear the branks for a whole day. This set comes from the 17th century and was used during the time of Archbishop Sharp. In 1563, the Scottish Parliament, now officially Protestant, passed the Witchcraft Act. This act stated that any person who used witchcraft, sorcery, or necromancy was to be put to death. Now, this law was not repealed until 1736, and during that time it's thought that almost 4,000 people appeared at local or central courts facing these charges. Of these, 84% of those accused were women, and about 2/3 of them were executed. It should be kept in mind, however, that this was not an exclusively Presbyterian or even Protestant issue. Indeed, from about 1560 to about 1630, those convicted of witchcraft were being executed in both Protestant and Catholic countries, with estimates of tens of thousands having been executed. Christmas celebrations had been lavish affairs, particularly by the wealthy. In 1540, King James and Queen Mary spent quite a lot of money on gorgeous garments for all the festivities. Detailed accounts of their apparel helped create these replicas. Then in the 1570s, the predominantly Presbyterian Parliament began the process of the banning of the celebrating of Christmas. However, in the early 1600s, during the rule of King James I, the Archbishop of St Andrews and one of the leading advocates of Episcopalianism, John Spottiswoode, revived the traditional celebrations of Christmas. However, following the defeat of Charles I in the Bishop Wars, in the year 1640, the Presbyterian Parliament passed an act that made the celebration illegal. This law remained in place until the early 18th century. After James VI became King James I of England in 1603, he tried to reimpose episcopacy on the Scottish Church. All this was done to cement his authority over the Church, seeing an independent Church as a threat to his authority. In 1607, he tried to establish perpetual moderators over each presbytery in the Church. This was essentially a bishop by any other name. And he also began to try and control the General Assembly. In 1618, James introduced changes in church practices with the so-called 5 Articles of Perth. These articles made kneeling at communion obligatory. As this communion plate shows, kneeling to take communion had been a practice of both Catholics and High Anglicans. The articles were passed by the Scottish Parliament 3 years later in 1621, and leading Scottish Presbyterians were horrified, fearing that this was leading down the road of Catholicism. However, James backed down and did not enforce the 5 articles. This policy was adopted more rigorously by his son, Charles I, after he became king in 1625. Now, before going further, we'll have a brief historical overview of what was happening at this time. In the year 1589, James VI of Scotland married Anne of Denmark. Anne was actually the second daughter of King Frederick of Denmark, and importantly for the Scottish Presbyterians, she was a Protestant. On the 19th of November 1600, a second son to James and Anne was born at Dunfermline Palace. He was named Charles. It was only after his elder brother died that he became the heir to the throne. He was baptised as a Protestant in the Chapel Royal at Holyrood Palace. Charles was a sickly child who struggled to walk. He only stayed at Dunfermline for a year or two before travelling south and living the rest of his years in England. He would only return to Scotland once more. In 1625, Charles married Henrietta Maria from France. She was a French princess, and concerningly for the Scots, she was a Catholic. On the 29th of May 1630, Henrietta gave birth to their son at St James's Palace in London. He would become King Charles II. He was baptised a month later by Archbishop William Laud. King Charles I wanted to exercise more control over the Scottish Church, and so 6 years after his son was born in the year 1636, Charles I took the step of replacing John Knox's Book of Discipline with the Book of Canons. Significantly for the Scots, it stated that anyone who denied the king's supremacy in church matters would be excommunicated. Now, this was a direct challenge to the church's authority. In matters of faith, the church held to the view that the king's power was limited. But for Charles, he believed that as king he had authority over the church and indeed had a divine right to rule. Significant church leaders during these turbulent times were Alexander Henderson and Archibald Johnston of Warriston. In 1637, Archbishop Laud sought to force the Church of England's Book of Common Prayer on the Scots. This was an attempt by Laud, with the assistance of King Charles I, to uniform all polity, liturgy, and faith throughout the United Kingdom. This was a direct challenge to the freedom of Presbyterian Scotland. This included the imposition of the Revised English Prayer Book. Significantly, it enforced kneeling at communion, and this implied an exaltation of the bread and the wine which concerned the Presbyterians, as they feared it was the beginning of a return to the Catholic practices of the Mass itself. It was here at St Giles, the main church in Edinburgh, on the 23rd of July, 1637, that the English prayer book was being introduced at the Sunday service. A woman worshipper at the service by the name of Jenny Geddes, so incensed by this that she took up her simple church stool and threw it at the pulpit when the prayer book was being introduced. A riot ensued, and it's argued that this act contributed to both the bishops' wars and the emergence of the group called the Covenanters. The riots soon spread as this illustration showing the Archprelate of St Andrews facing a barrage of objects as he tried to read the new service books. Over the next 6 months, those opposing these changes began to organise themselves, and so on February the 28th, 1638, leading Scottish nobles gathered at Greyfriars Churchyard in Edinburgh to sign a national covenant which had been drafted. By signing the document, they pledged themselves to maintain the Reformed, or in other words, the Presbyterian form of faith. The group who signed this covenant became known as the Covenanters. They became an important movement in the religion and politics of Scotland at this time. This handwritten and signed copy of the National Covenant can be found in St Giles Cathedral. Many regard this document as a move away from the accepted idea of the divine right of rule claimed by the kings to a more participatory modern democracy. Perhaps significantly, many Scottish Presbyterians were involved in the forming of the Declaration of Independence and the drafting of the US Constitution. It was Alexander Henderson and Archibald Johnston who were mainly responsible for the final form of the National Covenant. The Covenant consisted of 3 main aspects: a King's Confession drawn up in 1581 by John Craig, a recital of the Acts of Parliament against superstitious and papistical rites, and an elaborate oath to maintain the true Reformed religion. It was a defensive document which purported to support both Presbyterianism and the king. In terms of its specifics, the covenant began with an oath. Those signing it were agreeing to
maintain the said true religion.
There was also a promise to defend the Presbyterian Kirk,
and shall defend the same, according to our vocation and power, all the days of our lives.
There was then a lengthy statement regarding the beliefs of the Presbyterians. Principally, this was a critique and a rejection of specific Catholic practices and teaching. It said,
"We abhor and detest all contrary religion and doctrine, but chiefly all kind of papistry in general, blasphemous opinion of transubstantiation or real presence of Christ's body in the elements, his devilish mass, his blasphemous priesthood, his profane sacrifice for the sins of the dead and the quick, his canonization of men, calling upon angels or saints departed, worshipping of imagery, relics and crosses."
The National Covenant was not a politically revolutionary document. Indeed, it stated a promise to defend the person and authority of the king, but it did subtly focus on encouraging the right or good behaviour of the king. For the Presbyterians, the king was never above God's law.
We perceive that the quietness and stability of our religion and kirk doth depend upon the safety and good behaviour of the King's Majesty. We protest and promise with our hearts under the same oath, handwrit and pains, that we shall defend his person and authority with our goods, bodies and lives.
It was Johnston who read the document to the assembled crowd. It was a huge document, and it was then set down on a flat rock for signing. The next day, there was a public signing where clergy and the burgesses came to sign. And then the National Covenant was distributed to the four corners of Scotland to be subscribed by all. Some individuals, it's said, from the southwestern portion of Scotland are thought to have signed the National Covenant in their own blood. One of those involved in drawing up the National Covenant was Alexander Henderson, who was minister at Leuchars in Fife. He was also rector at the University of Edinburgh and the moderator of the Assembly, which in the same year of 1638 defied King Charles I, and they abolished bishops and they rejected Laud's liturgy. The opposition to Charles I grew into open conflict when in 1639 and 1640 there were a number of armed conflicts in Scotland as well as Northern Ireland and England. These conflicts were known as the Bishops' Wars. In August 1640, Charles's army was defeated by the Scots in a battle near Newcastle, and this stopped Charles's attempts to force changes on the Scottish Church. Then in 1642, open rebellion against the king began in England. This started what has been termed the English Civil War. Although arguably primarily a political struggle between the king and Parliament, it also had religious overtones. Now, the English Civil War is divided into three distinct periods. The First English Civil War from 1642 through to 1646, the Second English Civil War in 1648, and the Third English Civil War that took place after the execution of Charles I in the years 1649 to 1651. Now, together, this was part of a wider conflict known as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, which took place between the years 1639 to 1653, and they involved England, Ireland, and Scotland. The strong Protestant Parliament had been concerned with King Charles's increasing shift towards Catholicism. His marriage in 1625 to the Catholic Princess of France, Henrietta Maria, along with the appointment of the High Churchman William Laud to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury, particularly worried those with Puritan leanings within the Church. As a result of the conflict with Parliament, Charles had to flee London, initially to Hampton Court Palace, and then further west to Windsor Palace, and finally to Oxford. Both sides raised armies which led to the first of many battles in the October of 1642. The result was indecisive, and so the parliamentarians sought the help of the Scots. In 1643, a solemn league and covenant was signed. This was a treaty of alliance between the Covenanters in Scotland and the Puritan Parliament of England. Significantly, under the Solemn League and Covenant, the signatories agreed to establish Presbyterianism as the national church in England and Ireland. In exchange, the Covenanters from Scotland agreed to support the English parliamentarians against Charles I. For the Covenanters, Jesus was king over both church and state. Those who signed the Solemn League and Covenant stated that they
shall endeavour to bring the churches of God in the three kingdoms to the nearest conjunction and uniformity in religion, confession of faith, form of church government, directory for worship, and catechizing, that we and our posterity after us may, as brethren, live in faith and love, and the Lord may delight to dwell in the midst of us.
Note that the Solemn League went further than the National Covenant. Here, it was a pledge to not only make Presbyterianism the only church polity in Scotland, but to advocate that the same church governance be in all the churches of England and Ireland as well. In order to bring the Scottish Presbyterians and the English Puritans closer together, a Westminster Assembly was commissioned by the English Parliament. The purpose of this assembly was to draft a confession which could be theologically agreed to between the English Puritans and the Scottish Presbyterians. From the years 1643 through to 1653, the Church of England clerics and Scottish Presbyterians got together at Westminster Abbey to work on a common creed. The resulting Westminster Confession was drawn up and was agreed to by the General Assembly of the Scottish Church in 1647. Samuel Rutherford was an important theologian at this time. In 1647, he became one of the contributors to the Westminster Confession of Faith, and in the same year, he was appointed principal of St Mary's at St Andrews. Subsequently, he became the rector of the University of St Andrews. He was, at this time, a preeminent Scottish scholar and leader. In a letter of 1635, he expressed a wish to live to see the conversion of the Jews. His attitude towards the Jews in this letter stand in contrast to the hardened attitude of some Protestants and Catholics from that time.
Oh, to see the sight next to Christ's coming in the clouds, the most joyful, our elder brethren the Jews, and Christ fall upon one another's necks and kiss each other. They have been long asunder, they will be kind to one another when they meet. O day, O longed for and lovely day dawn. O sweet Jesus, let me see that sight which will be as life from the dead, thee and the ancient people in mutual embraces.
Rutherford is, perhaps here, describing a post-millennialist position. He found a place for Israel in prophecy. Rutherford is best known for his work Lex Rex, The Law and the Prince, which was printed in 1644 prior to the removal of Charles I. So its content was relevant to those challenging times. In Lex Rex, he argued against the doctrine of the divine right of kings. In contrast, he promoted equality under the law, which included kings. He also argued that there were inalienable rights of all people. He emphasised government by consent, the separation of the state and the church powers, and he defended the right to resist and even revolt against lawful authority in some circumstances. He said that Scripture was to be the standard by which we judge civil government, and all this was timely with regard to the revolt against Charles I. His idea that the power of the ruler is not absolute can be seen in this quote from Lex Rex.
That power which is obliged to command and rule justly and religiously for the good of the subjects, and is only set over the people on these conditions and not absolutely, cannot tie the people to subjection without resistance when the power is abused to the destruction of laws, religion, and the subjects.
After the so-called Restoration of 1660, the authorities burned Lex Rex and cited Rutherford for high treason, but he died before he went to trial. Regarding suffering, Rutherford said,
"Praise God for the hammer, the file, and the furnace. The hammer moulds us, the file sharpens us, and the fire tempers us."
Now, meanwhile, in England, the English parliamentarians were led by Oliver Cromwell and his new model army. After a number of battles, the Royalists, or the supporters of Charles I, were defeated, and Charles fled Oxford. Eventually, Charles was delivered into the hands of his captors in the January of 1647. He spent most of that year under house arrest, and while back at Hampton Court, he escaped, but was soon held captive again. However, he used this time to negotiate with the Scottish Parliament. In the December of 1647, the Scottish Parliament began to engage with Charles I and his supporters. Charles agreed to allowing Scottish Presbyterianism for 3 years, and so what was called the engagement was agreed to. Now that the king seemingly sided with the Covenanters, they then were involved in a conflict with Cromwell and the parliamentarians. The so-called engagement army was established, and they marched to Preston in England. However, in 1648 they were soundly defeated there by Cromwell's model army. Into this political and power vacuum came a far more radical group of Presbyterians from the southwest of the country. They were called the Whigamores and became known as the Kirk Party. They marched to Edinburgh. They took the city. And so Scotland was in the hands of the Kirk Party, and a period known as the Rule of Saints began. They began to purge Parliament of anyone who was considered as ungodly, and the army came under the direct management of the church. In reality, Scotland was now under the rule of a religious theocracy by this particularly radical group of Presbyterians. The leading figure of the Kirk Party was the noble Archibald Campbell, the first Marquis of Argyll. Archibald Johnston, the Lord of Warriston, was also a member of the Kirk Party. Now that the Kirk Party had absolute power, strict social discipline was imposed. Backsliding and adultery were punishable by death. No sin was left unpunished, and the punishments included holes being made in tongues and ears being nailed to posts. Public floggings became more commonplace, and even the powerful nobles were sometimes humiliated before Kirk sessions for their moral lapses. On the 23rd of January 1649, the Act of Classes was passed by the Parliament, which was now dominated by the Kirk Party. Those who had supported the previous engagement were excluded from office, Parliament, and the army. There was also a further purge, again with the loss of expertise, and so now the Kirk Party had total control. The power of the nobles at this time was particularly curtailed. However, unfortunately, this caused much expertise to be lost, and this in particular impacted the army. In addition, church attendance was made compulsory. On the positive side, every parish was to have a school, which was to be paid for by the landowners, and as a result, Scotland would have one of the highest literacy rates in Europe. There was also a resurgence in witch hunting, and traders were no longer to trade with Catholic nations. Throughout the Civil War, the majority of Scots agreed that the institution of the monarchy itself was divinely ordained, and it also should not be forgotten that Charles I was, after all, born a Scot. So largely, the Scots supported the restoration of Charles I. Thus, they were shocked when Charles was executed on the 30th of January 1649. The Covenanters then committed themselves to the cause of Charles's son, Charles II, and in 1650 they signed the Treaty of Breda with him in the hope of securing an independent Presbyterian Scotland, free of parliamentary interference. Charles landed in Scotland on the 23rd of June, and he signed both the 1638 Covenant and the 1643 Solemn League immediately after coming to shore. However, Charles was no supporter of Presbyterianism. He was also relatively quite young, about 19, and he needed the support of the ruling Scots. So the signing of these documents was done under some sufferance, and over time his attitude towards the Presbyterians hardened. Cromwell then marched north, and he defeated the army of the Kirk party at the Battle of Dunbar on the 3rd of September 1650. The Kirk party's rule over Scotland was weakened, and so a more moderate group called the Resolutioners gradually took over the political leadership. Those who had supported the Kirk party were then called the Protesters. Even Archibald Campbell, who'd been the leader of the Kirk party, was dissatisfied with them, and now he threw his support behind the Resolutioners. Effectively, all these events meant that the rule of saints came to an end. In an attempt to unify the divided Scots, on New Year's Day, Charles II was crowned at Scone, just north of Perth. Now, Scone was the traditional location for the crowning of Scottish kings, and Archibald Campbell helped place the crown on Charles's head. After the Battle of Dunbar, many of the captured Covenanters were sold as indentured servants in America. After a number of further conflicts, Cromwell held sway over significant parts of Scotland. Meanwhile, Charles and his supporters headed south into England, but at the Battle of Worcester, the Royalist army was defeated by Cromwell. Charles, however, managed to escape and made his way to the safe haven of France. Cromwell was now in charge of Scotland and held this power until his death in the September of 1658. It was after his death that the voices of opposition to the reinstating of the monarchy dissipated. And so in 1660, Charles II took up the throne of England and Scotland, and this was known as the Restoration. However, any thought that Charles would support the Presbyterians soon evaporated. Very early on, he decided to ignore his promises to honour the covenants. In order to keep with the king's wishes, in March 1661, the Rescissory Act was passed by the Scottish Parliament. This act aimed to dismantle the religious and political changes that had been implemented by the Covenanters during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. In the following year, all the churches, other than the National Church or the Church of Scotland, were banned, and all office bearers in the church had to renounce the covenants, and about a third of them refused. One of those who rebuked Charles for his lack of commitment to the covenants was one of the authors, Archibald Johnston. He also knew that his support of Cromwell meant that his life was now in danger, and so he fled the country. He was charged with treason in absentia, discovered, arrested, and sent back to England. After initially spending time in the Tower of London, he was sent back to Edinburgh. Archibald Johnston was hanged at Mercat Cross, the location of the Old Market in Edinburgh, on the 22nd of July, 1663. The Covenanters began to openly reject the king as the head of the church, proclaiming that King Jesus was the rightful head. And over time, the attitude of some hardened to the point where they were willing to use force in defence of their cause. One of those who supported Episcopalianism was James Sharp, the Archbishop of St Andrews. On the 3rd of May, 1669, a group of 9 Covenanters stopped the coach in which Sharp was travelling. Sharp was stabbed a number of times before being shot and killed. He was later buried in the Holy Trinity Church in St Andrews. James Sharp was seen as a martyr, as this monument inside the church says. It describes him as a most holy martyr who was most cruelly murdered on account of the fury of fanaticism. The extreme actions of the Covenanters led to an increased opposition, and they were referred to as fanatics, as this 1680 document states. Presbyterians who refused to abandon their support for the covenants were outlawed. They were forced then to hold secret services called conventicles. Often they held these in the open air and in remote places. In 1670, Parliament outlawed these conventicles. The punishment was very harsh. For example, any minister who organised such an open-aired meeting was to be executed. Large rewards were even offered to those who captured such ministers. And indeed, if anyone killed such a minister, then they were indemnified under the law. On the 1st of June 1679, a number of Presbyterians held a conventicle near Loudon Hill, not far from the small village of Drumclog. This was about 25 kilometres south of Glasgow. John Graham of Claverhouse was a leading figure in opposing the Covenanters. He was known as the Bloody Clavers by the Covenanters due to his brutal repression of them. Claverhouse had heard that a conventicle was being planned to be held at Loudon Hill, and so he organised the King's troops to go and engage with the Covenanters. Some of the Covenanters had come to the conventicle armed, and they were also forewarned by scouts that the King's soldiers were on their way. Although they were outnumbered, the Covenanters made good use of the rough and the boggy terrain. So, led by Robert Hamilton, about 200 of these armed Covenanters were able to successfully defeat the King's soldiers. This became known as the Battle of Drumclog. Claverhouse and his forces then retreated back to Glasgow. Buoyed by their success at Drumclog, Hamilton soon had at his disposal a large force, and they then marched on Glasgow. In response, James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, who also happened to be the illegitimate son of Charles II, along with John Graham of Claverhouse, organised a large army to oppose the Covenanters, led by Robert Hamilton. They met at Bothwell Bridge, which is just to the southeast of Glasgow. The King's forces numbered 5,000, and the Covenanters numbered 6,000. Now, while there were more Covenanters, they were divided by theological disagreements, and they were not as well equipped or as well trained as the King's army, who were made up of regular troops. The forces met on either side of the Clyde, the King's forces on the north and the Covenanters on the south. On June the 22nd, 1679, the King's forces crossed over the bridge and attacked the Covenanters, who rapidly retreated and were soundly defeated. It's claimed that as many as 600 Covenanters were killed, although this high number is disputed. However, around 1,200 Covenanters were captured. The battle has come to be known as the Battle of Bothwell Brig. The Covenanters' flag first appeared in 1639 and later appeared in various forms. It was carried into conflicts such as at Drum Clog and Bothwell Brig. There were cases of summary execution of those suspected of being Covenanters. In the same month as the battle at Bothwell Brig, Arthur Ingalls of Netherton was callously murdered, allegedly for being found by Claverhouse's forces reading a Bible while in a field looking after his cattle. From the years 1680 to 1688, thousands of Covenanters died in their resistance of changes to their worship. This became known as the killing time. In 1679, the area behind these gates, located next to Greyfriars Church in Edinburgh, was used as a prison for more than 1,000 Covenanters after their defeat at Bothwell Bridge. They were held here for 4 months, without shelter and on meagre bread rations. Many died here. Some were executed. Some escaped. And some were freed after they signed an agreement to be loyal to the king. The remaining 257 men were sentenced to transportation overseas, and in November of 1679 they were placed on board a ship bound for the American colonies. However, the ship was wrecked off the coast of the Orkney Islands, and nearly all the men drowned. On July the 22nd of 1680, a party made up of 112 government troops came across a small number of Covenanters at Aird's Moss. Their leader was Richard Cameron. A brief battle occurred in which 28 government troops and 9 Covenanters were killed, including Richard Cameron and his brother Michael. Some Covenanters escaped, but about 5 were captured, and they were taken to Edinburgh, where they were later hanged. In 1683, about 70 people, most of whom were Covenanters, were thrown into the lower prison rooms below the Great Hall in Edinburgh Castle. Some of these prisoners were tortured. Amongst the devices used were the so-called boot, which shattered the legs of its victims. And then there was the thumbikins, which crushed their thumbs. One of those who endured both the thumbikins and the boot was William Carstairs during his second imprisonment in the castle in 1684. Carstairs was a minister in the Church of Scotland, and after his release and the Glorius Revolution of 1688, he became the principal of Edinburgh University and 4-time moderator and a significant leader in the Church of Scotland. In the February of 1685, Charles II died. Charles and his wife had been unable to provide an heir, So the throne was given to his younger brother, James. James II of England, or James VII of Scotland, inherited the throne from his brother, and he ruled as king between the years 1685 to 1688. Crucially, James was a Roman Catholic, and when he bore a son, there was concern that Catholicism would replace Protestantism in England and Scotland. A memorial to all those Covenanters who were executed during the rule of Charles II and James II can be found in the Grassmarket area of Edinburgh. It's located near to where the gibbet once stood, and where more than 100 Covenanters were executed between the years 1661 to 1688. By the 1680s, the Covenanters had been reduced to a radical minority under the leadership of Alexander Peden and James Renwick, although sympathy to Presbyterianism was still widespread in Scotland. Peden had to go around using this mask and wig. He was a field preacher and was on the run from the forces of Charles after preaching against the imposed religious changes. This mask must have been effective, as he was never caught. This was the Bible of the field preacher William Hannay. He was a Covenanter during the killing time. He hid his Bible among the straw in his barn when he saw government troops approaching. He escaped into the hills, leaving his Bible behind, and returned later to find it damaged by a sword that had been thrust into the hay. The troops hoping they would strike Hannay. William Hannay continued to be hunted and was eventually captured. He would suffer cruel imprisonment in the dungeon at Dumfries and later at the horrific Donata Castle. After some years in prison, his health deteriorated, and close to death, he was released to die at home. His son, also a Covenanter, was hunted and eventually captured and exiled to the island of Barbados in the West Indies. One story of particular heroism came from the Covenanters Margaret Wilson and Margaret McLaughlin. They were both chained to stakes which were placed in the river Bladnoch in order to be drowned by the rising waters of Solway Firth. When asked if she would abjure the covenant, the 18-year-old Wilson replied,
"Never. I am Christ's. Let me go."
Their martyrdom took place on the 11th of May, 1685. In the Valley Cemetery in Stirling, there's a memorial to Margaret Wilson. It depicts her reading the Bible with her young sister Agnes, watched over by a despairing guardian angel. This memorial at Greyfriars is dedicated to all those Covenanters who died during these turbulent times of the late 17th century, particularly those who died between the years 1680 to 1688. It's thought that possibly as many as 18,000 Covenanters were martyred for their beliefs. Here is a little of what the inscription states.
Here lies interred the dust of those who stood against perjury, resisting unto blood, adhering to the covenant and laws, establishing the same which was the cause. Then lives were sacrificed unto the lust of prelatists abjured. Though here their dust lies mixed with murderers and other crew, whom justice justly did to death pursue. But as for them, no cause was to be found worthy of death, but only they were found constant and steadfast, zealous as for the prerogative of Christ their King.
As a result of growing opposition, James II, the King of England, Scotland and Ireland, was deposed and replaced by his daughter, Mary II, and her husband, William III of Orange, who was the stadtholder, or the de facto ruler of the Dutch Republic. Shortly after the accession of William of Orange, the Act of Settlement led to the abolition of episcopacy in the Church of Scotland. The Act of Settlement of 1690 finally settled the Reformed Scottish Church as Presbyterian. In November, the Scottish General Assembly met and accepted this settlement. However, significantly, this was the state effectively telling the Church how it should run its affairs. For example, the settlement meant that the King had the power to appoint the time and the place of meeting for the General Assembly, as well as the power to dissolve the Assembly. In addition, the state retained a measure of control over the matter of calling and inducting ministers. There were some who rejected this continued state control over the Church as being unbiblical. They were originally called Cameronians, but over time they formed the Reformed Presbyterian Church, or Reformed Presbytery, in 1743. They were, however, quite a small group. The Patronage Act of 1711 laid down set rules on how ministers would be chosen, and this was based on the Scottish ideas of feudal hierarchy. It gave the landowners, called patrons, the right to appoint ministers to vacant pulpits. This led to an increasing dissent among the Scottish clergy, who felt that this took away the power of the congregations to decide who should be their minister. The so-called First Secession was an exodus of ministers and members from the Church of Scotland in 1733. Those who took part formed the Associate Presbytery, and later it was called the United Secession Church. The underlying principles of the split focused on the perceived threat to the right of a congregation to choose its own minister. A more significant breakaway took place in 1843. This was with the forming of the so-called Free Church. It was formed by evangelicals who broke from the Church of Scotland to protest against what they regarded as the state's encroachment on the spiritual independence of the Church. And one of the significant figures in this breakaway was Thomas Chalmers. In 1876, the majority of Reformed Presbyterians joined the Free Church of Scotland. Now we've come to the end of our examination of the events in the church in Scotland in the 17th century. In the next video, we'll be following events that impacted the Christian faith in Europe in that same century. There will be a focus, in particular, on the persecution of the Huguenots in France, the events of the 30 Years' War, as well as the theological controversy over Arminianism in the Dutch Reformed Church.